The marriage was the mechanism. I have removed the mechanism's purpose. Before you begin, I have a matter to introduce to the proceedings.
You are not what I expected.
No, I'm not. Apologize for your wasted morning. I hope the flowers are of some consolation.
Marry me in 24 hours, or your family hangs. The cruel Duke said what she did at the altar left him speechless. The church was full of people who had come to watch a woman be broken. Viola Ashby knew this the way she knew the weight of the veil on her hair and the cold of the flagstone through her thin wedding slippers as simple physical fact. The pews held tenants and tradespeople and county families, all of them arranged in the held-breath stillness of an audience that has been told the ending in advance. The Duke of Cavendrath stood at the altar with his back to her, and even from the rear he communicated the quality of a man accustomed to receiving things without asking. She had been given 24 hours. Her father and 2 brothers were in a jail in Exeter at this moment, awaiting the Duke's word. 1 letter from him, and they walked free. 1 letter of a different kind, and they hanged for a treason charge that Viola knew, with the cold certainty of a woman who had read every document twice, was a fabrication assembled with patience and malice and money. She reached the altar. The Duke turned. He had a face that had been handsome once and had curdled into something harder, not ugly but sharp in the way of a tool kept too long for cutting. He looked at her the way a man looks at a signed contract, with satisfaction and without interest in the terms. The vicar opened his book, and Viola Ashby, whose hands had not trembled once in the carriage, whose veil had not shaken during the processional, whose voice had not broken when she kissed her mother goodbye that morning, reached into the white roses of her bridal bouquet and produced a document of her own. But let me tell you how she got there, because the woman who walked into that church was not the woman who had received the Duke's ultimatum. That woman had been afraid. This one had decided to be something else entirely. 3 weeks earlier, Viola had been doing what she did most mornings, sitting at the long table in her father's study, working through the estate correspondence that her father, Gerald Ashby, had never managed with any systematic attention. He was a warm man, her father, generous, easily delighted, constitutionally unsuited to anything requiring sequential thought. He loved his land, his family, his dogs, and his neighbors, in approximately that order. He had managed the Ashby estate at Tronyard for 30 years, through a combination of goodwill and lucky timing that had now comprehensively run out. It was Viola who had seen the debt accumulating. Viola who had written to the solicitors, restructured the accounts, sold the London house quietly before anyone could object. She was 25, the eldest of 3 children, and the only one who had inherited her mother's capacity for cold arithmetic alongside her father's warmth. Her brother Thomas was 22 and studying law in a dilatory fashion. Her brother Peter was 19 and interested primarily in horses. Her mother Catherine ran the household and the garden and left the business to Viola with the frank delegation of a woman who knows her own strengths. It was a workable arrangement. It had been working. Until the morning the letter arrived from a man who signed himself R. Cavendrath, and whose handwriting had the over-controlled quality of someone who had learned precision as a discipline rather than inheriting it as a temperament. She read it once, then again. Then she set it down on the table and looked out the window at the November fields and breathed in the steady, deliberate way she had taught herself during the worst of the financial crisis, when the numbers had been very bad and she had needed her hands to stay functional. The letter informed her that Gerald Ashby and his 2 sons had been identified as participants in a conspiracy against the crown. The evidence, the letter said, was substantial. The Duke of Cavendrath, as a man of influence and civic responsibility, had naturally brought this to the attention of the relevant authorities, but retained, given his regard for the Ashby family's long standing in the county, the ability to intercede on their behalf. His terms were simple. Miss Viola Ashby would consent to marriage within 24 hours of his formal proposal, which he intended to make in person the following morning. Upon the solemnization of the marriage, he would withdraw the evidence and secure the release of the prisoners. Should she decline, the matter would proceed through the courts. He added in a postscript written in the same controlled hand that he hoped she would find the terms agreeable. He had always, he wrote, held her in the highest esteem. Viola read the postscript twice. Then she folded the letter, placed it in the locked drawer of her desk, and went to find her mother. Catherine Ashby was in the garden cutting the last of the autumn roses when Viola came around the corner of the house. She looked up at her daughter's face, set down her shears without being asked, and said, "How bad?" "Considerable." They sat on the stone bench beneath the kitchen wall, and Viola told her everything. Catherine listened without interrupting, which was one of the things Viola had always loved about her mother. She had the capacity to receive bad news as information rather than catastrophe, at least in the first minutes, before the feelings arrived. When Viola finished, Catherine was quiet for a long moment. A robin landed on the handle of the abandoned shears and regarded them both. "The charge is fabricated," Catherine said. "I believe so, but belief and proof are different things, and he has had more time than us to assemble his version." "Why us? Why now?" This was the question Viola had been turning since she'd read the letter. Cavendrath's estate bordered theirs to the north. He was 51 to her 25, twice widowed, a man whose name appeared in county records and parliamentary business alike, with the frequency of someone who understood that presence was its own form of influence. He'd attended her father's dinners 3 times in the past year. He had spoken to Viola about the estate management on one occasion, at a length that had slightly surprised her, and she had answered his questions with the frankness she brought to all such conversations. "The Northfield," she said. Her mother looked at her. "The boundary dispute. It has been in correspondence for 2 years. Father's solicitor found the original survey last spring. It gives us 6 acres that Cavendrath has been farming as his own for a decade." She paused. "I sent a formal notice of claim in September." Catherine absorbed this. And 3 weeks later, the robin flew away. The garden was very still. "What will you do?" her mother asked. Not what should we do, not what can we do, but you, with the specific confidence of a woman who has always known which of her children carries the load. "I'm going to need 2 days," Viola said, "and I'm going to need Mr. Harcroft." Harcroft was their solicitor. He was 70, meticulous, and possessed of a filing system so comprehensive that he had once located a deed dated 1743 in under 4 minutes. More importantly, he had been Gerald Ashby's solicitor since Gerald was 20, which meant he had 40 years of Ashby family documents and a loyalty that Viola intended to use. "And the Duke's proposal?" her mother said. "He arrives tomorrow morning." Viola picked up a fallen rose petal from the bench and turned it in her fingers. "I will receive him. Viola, I will receive him, and I will listen to him, and I will give him an answer." She set the petal down. "But I intend to know everything I can before I decide what that answer is." Her mother looked at her for a long moment, the searching look she'd given Viola since childhood, the one checking not for weakness, but for the strain that precedes breaking. She apparently found what she needed. "I'll have Mrs. Greer prepare the formal parlor," she said, and picked up her shears. The Duke of Cavendrath arrived at 11 the following morning in a carriage that managed to communicate wealth without ostentation, which Viola noted as a deliberate choice. He was taller than she remembered from the dinner table, and he had the posture of a man who had been told his entire life that rooms were improved by his entrance. He sat in the formal parlor's best chair without being directed to it, another choice, and looked at Viola across the tea tray with an expression of benign expectation. "Miss Ashby," he said, "I trust you received my letter." "I did, Your Grace." "And you understood its contents." "I understood them entirely." He nodded, as though she had confirmed something he had never doubted. He had, she noticed, very clean hands. He looked at them occasionally, briefly, as though reassuring himself they were still there. "Then I hope you will appreciate that what I propose is not unkindness," he said. "Your family faces a serious difficulty. I am in a position to resolve it. The arrangement I suggest is mutually beneficial." "To whom, specifically, is it beneficial to me?" He went still. Not the stillness of a man composing himself, something slower than that, a recalibration happening behind his eyes. "You would have the security of my name and estate," he said. "Your family would be preserved. Your brothers would be free to pursue their careers without the impediment of a criminal charge. And you would have a wife young enough to manage," she said. "You would have the Ashby North Field, which your claim to has just been formally contested, and which you would acquire through marriage more cleanly than through courts. And you would have the satisfaction of resolving an irritant." She looked at him steadily. "Those are your benefits. I was asking about mine." The room held that for a moment. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't immediately classify. Not anger, not admiration, something between the two that hadn't settled into either. "You are direct," he said. "You proposed a legal transaction. I am treating it as one. Most women in your position. I am not most women in my position." She poured the tea that neither of them would drink. "Your Grace, I will give you an answer to your proposal. I will give it to you in 24 hours, as your letter specified. In exchange, I ask that you grant me those hours without interference." He looked at her steadily. "You intend to look for a way out?" "I intend," she said, "to understand what I am agreeing to before I agree to it. If you find that unreasonable, it tells me more about the arrangement than your letter did." He was quiet. Then, with the smallest adjustment of his posture, a thing so slight she might have imagined it, he said, 24 hours, Miss Ashby. Not a minute more." He left without the tea. She watched his carriage turn down the lane, and then she was already moving. For her coat, for the door, for the horse that would take her the 6 miles to Harcroft's office in town. She had 23 hours and 40 minutes. Harcroft received her in his filing room, which smelled of paper and beeswax and decades of other people's troubles. He was a small, precise man who had long since stopped being surprised by anything the Ashby family brought through his door, and he listened to Viola's account with his hands flat on the desk and his eyes on a point slightly above her left shoulder, which was how he concentrated. When she finished, he said, "The treason charge." "Yes." "What specifically?" "The letter says correspondence with a foreign party for purposes inimical to the Crown. It does not specify further." Harcroft's eyes came down from the middle distance. "That charge requires documentary evidence, letters, records of meeting, financial transactions. It cannot be constructed from nothing. No, it requires constructed documents, or genuine documents taken out of context." She paused and felt the familiar tightness across her chest that came with the worst moments, the ones where the numbers were bad and getting worse. "My father corresponded with a wool merchant in Bruges for 15 years. The correspondence was entirely commercial." "Bruges," Harcroft said very quietly, and rose from his desk. He was in the files for 11 minutes. Viola sat and did not move, and listened to the sound of him searching and thought about her father at his dinner table, pouring wine for a man who had already decided to destroy him. She thought about Thomas and his law books, Peter with his horses, her mother in the garden. She thought about the September letter she had sent, a routine notice, 3 paragraphs, filed as a matter of legal procedure, and the family it had apparently brought down. When Harcroft returned, he had 3 folders, a leather-bound ledger, and an expression of concentrated attention she recognized as his version of urgency. "Your father," he said, is not the primary target. She went very still. Explain. The Ashby estate's northern boundary runs along the edge of Cavendrath's planned railway extension. He opened the ledger and turned it to face her. He has parliamentary approval pending for a line that requires that corridor. Your father's land, specifically the disputed 6 acres and the access road through the north field, is the only obstacle to the most direct route. The survey was filed 4 months ago. Viola looked at the ledger, at the survey, at the dates. She read them twice, the way she read everything important, and the second time was worse than the first. Her September notice, her 3 careful paragraphs of legal procedure, the letter she had written at this same desk, in this same study, as a matter of routine. She had not fired a shot in some larger war. She had not stumbled into politics or treason, or any of the charged territory the Duke's letter had implied. She had simply done her job, protected her family's land with the tools available to her, and a man with a railway map and a parliamentary approval had looked at her letter and decided that the cleanest solution was to have her father arrested and her married off within the month. The fire in Harcroft's grate ticked. Outside, a woman called to someone in the street, her voice ordinary and unhurried, belonging to a world where the ground was still where people had left it. Viola pressed her palms flat against the desk. He didn't want the marriage, she said. The words came out slowly, each one arriving as she found it. He wanted the claim withdrawn. The marriage was just the mechanism. Yes. Harcroft watched her steadily. A wife cannot contest her husband's property rights, and a family facing criminal prosecution tends to abandon civil claims. She sat with that, let it settle into its full shape. This was not a man who had seen her across a dinner table and decided he wanted her for his wife. This was a man who had received a legal notice and reached for the nearest available instrument. She was not the object of his scheme. She was an obstacle in it, an obstacle he had decided to repurpose. The anger that arrived was cold and clear, nothing like the ragged feeling she'd been carrying since the letter. This was something she could use. What do I need? She said. To contest the charge, you would need evidence of fabrication. That takes time we do not have. He paused. To contest the marriage, you would need grounds. And to protect the land? He was quiet for a moment that felt longer than it was. There is a third option, he said carefully. It is irregular. Tell me. He told her. It was, as he had said, irregular. The kind of solution that required a night's work and a willingness to act before the other party realized the ground had shifted. It would not save her family from the charge directly. It would remove the reason for the charge to be sustained. She sat with it. A woman who had not learned to think under pressure would have said yes immediately. The relief of a plan after hours of none. But Viola had learned, in years of account books and estate letters and conversations with men who assumed she would defer, that the cost of a decision lives in its details. She turned Harcroft's proposal over slowly, looking at each face of it. The risk was real. If the Duke moved before morning, if the documents were not ready, if a single element of the filing was challenged, if this fails, she said, then you are in the same position as now, and no worse. Harcroft met her eyes. But it will not fail. I have done more complex work in less time. She looked at the survey on the desk, at the north field, reduced to a line on a map, at the access road her father had walked every morning of her childhood. Can you have the documents prepared by morning? She said. I have kept stranger hours for lesser causes, Harcroft said, and was already reaching for his pen. You will have them by midnight. She returned home to find her mother waiting, and her father's letter, forwarded from the jail by a sympathetic clerk, sitting on the hall table. She read it in the doorway without taking off her coat. Her father's handwriting was shakier than usual, the letters pressing harder than they needed to in the way of someone writing with cold hands or unsteady ones. But the words were entirely his. "Do not do it, my darling girl. Whatever he has asked, the cost is too high. We will find another way." She stood in the hall for a long time. The house was quiet around her, the evening quiet of a place whose inhabitants were being careful with each other, moving softly, not asking questions they didn't want answered. Somewhere upstairs, a floorboard. Her mother, she thought, not sleeping. She held the letter and she let herself be a daughter for a few minutes, which was something she had not permitted herself since the morning his arrest was confirmed. She thought of him writing this from a jail cell, thought of the deliberateness with which he must have formed each word, "Do not do it," knowing she might not listen, writing it anyway because he was her father, and it was the only thing he had left to give her. His refusal to let her sacrifice herself, his faith, even now, that there was another way, even though he had no idea what it was, even though he was the one sitting in a cell in Exeter, and she was the one who had to find it. We will find another way. She pressed her hand flat against her coat over the place where the letter rested. She breathed. Then she folded it carefully, not into her pocket, where she had been keeping the Duke's letter, the practical letter, the letter that required action, but into the inner pocket, against her ribs, where she would carry it tomorrow. She went upstairs. Her mother was in the corridor, a candle in hand, and they looked at each other in the way of two people who have run out of words that would help. "I need the night," Viola said. "I know." Her mother touched her face, briefly, with one hand, the same gesture she had used when Viola was small and frightened and pretending not to be. "Come and find me when it's done." Viola worked until the hall clock struck 3, the documents spread across the study table, checking and rechecking each clause, each date, each line of the transfer deed that Harcroft's boy had delivered at midnight as promised. Her mother appeared at 1 o'clock with tea and set it down without speaking and disappeared again. At 2, she reappeared with a candle to replace the one that had burned to nothing, and this time she sat in the chair by the cold fireplace and simply stayed, not asking, not watching, just present in the way that mothers are present when there is nothing practical left to offer. When Viola finally set down her pen, Catherine said, "Will it work?" "Yes." "You're certain?" "I'm certain enough." Viola looked at the documents. He wanted the land or the claim. By morning he can have neither. Once he has neither, the charge has no purpose and the witnesses have questions. She paused. "It will work." Her mother was quiet for a moment. And then, "Your father would say you shouldn't have to do this." "I know what he would say." Viola felt the letter against her ribs. "I've read it." Catherine rose, gathered the tea things, and stopped at the door. "He'd also say," she added quietly, "that he has never once in his life been surprised by what you're capable of." She looked back. "Nor have I." She left Viola with the candle and the documents and the specific silence of a house bracing itself for morning. The church was full of people who had come to watch a woman be broken. She had told her mother enough to ensure she would not intervene. Not everything. She had not wanted the fear on her mother's face to be something she had to carry down the aisle. She had simply said, "Trust me until I give you reason not to." And her mother, who had known her for 25 years, had pressed her hand and said nothing further. The Duke stood at the altar with his back to her. She walked the full length of the aisle in the specific silence of a congregation that doesn't know what it's watching. They had heard forced marriage in the whispers, had heard treason and Ashby and Cavendrath, and they had come as people come to such events, with the uneasy appetite of those who want drama and the discomfort of those who will have to live alongside the participants afterward. She reached the altar. He turned. His expression, when he saw her face, shifted almost imperceptibly. She wondered briefly what he had expected. Tears, perhaps, or the blankness of a woman who has surrendered. What he got was her eyes, which were clear and dry and looking directly at him, and the white roses of her bouquet, and the document folded inside them. The vicar opened his book. "Before you begin," Viola said, and her voice in the stone church was entirely steady, "I have a matter to introduce to the proceedings." Every head in the pews turned. She turned too, not to the Duke, but to the congregation. She had chosen this deliberately. A thing done in public is witnessed. A thing witnessed cannot easily be undone. "Many of you know my family," she said. "You know Tronyard. You know the Ashby name. You are here today because a charge has been made against my father and brothers, a charge which, if not answered, will see them hanged." She paused one beat, two. "I want you to know its nature. Miss Ashby," the Duke's voice was very quiet and very controlled, "this is not— I have here," she said, unfolding Harcroft's document, "a deed of transfer, witnessed last night, by which the disputed Northfield of Tronyard Estate, 6 acres and the access road, is conveyed in perpetuity to a charitable trust administered by the county for the purposes of agricultural education." She looked up. "It can no longer be purchased, acquired by marriage, or claimed through legal maneuver. It belongs to no private individual and never will again." The Duke was perfectly still. "I also have here a copy of the parliamentary survey for the Cavendrath Railway extension, which I have taken the liberty of distributing to 3 members of the county press this morning." She held it up. "This survey makes clear why my father's arrest was filed precisely 6 weeks after my boundary claim. It also makes clear that without the Northfield corridor, the railway cannot proceed on its current approved route, which means the parliamentary approval lapses and the entire scheme must be refiled." She turned to face him fully now. "You wanted the land," she said, "or you wanted the claim withdrawn. The marriage was the mechanism. I have removed the mechanism's purpose." She folded both documents and held them at her side. "The treason charge against my family is fabricated. You know this. I know this. And by tonight, 3 newspaper editors will know this, and will be asking questions that require answers." The congregation was utterly silent. She could hear the candles. "So I am here at this altar," she said, "to tell you, in front of every person in this county who matters, that I will not be marrying you today, and that if my father and brothers are not released by this evening, I will spend every resource I have and every connection I can find ensuring that the fabrication is not merely suspected, but proven." The Duke looked at her for a long moment. His face had the quality of a man revising his assessment of a situation he had believed he fully understood. His hands, those clean, controlled hands, were at his sides, and they were very still. "You," he said finally, "are not what I expected." "No," she said, "I'm not." She turned to the vicar, who had the expression of a man who has officiated many weddings, and never one quite like this. "I apologize for your wasted morning," she said. "I hope the flowers are of some consolation." She set the white roses on the altar step and walked back down the aisle. No one stopped her. She had not thought they would. And there is a specific quality to a plan that has been executed with sufficient precision. It generates its own momentum, and the people around it can feel that the thing is already done, and that intervention would be merely embarrassing. The door of the church was heavy oak. It swung open ahead of her into the November light. She walked through it. Her father and brothers were released the following afternoon. The treason charge evaporated when examined. It had been constructed on the Bruges correspondence, which in context was unmistakably commercial, and the fabricated elements required the Duke's continued interest to sustain. The Duke's interest had been redirected by the 3 newspaper editors who had questions, and by 2 members of Parliament who had concerns about the railway survey now circulating in county hands, and by the exposed position of a man whose mechanism had been dismantled in a church full of witnesses. Harcroft sent her a note that said simply, "Released at 4 o'clock. All well." She read it in the kitchen, standing still in her coat from the day's business, and she felt something shift in her chest. Not release exactly, but the easing of a load that has been carried for so long you have stopped noticing its weight. Her mother found her there and said nothing, only put her arms around her from behind, and Viola stood in the kitchen and let herself be held for the length of time it took the kettle to come to the boil. The Duke did not contact her. This was, she thought, the most honest thing he had done. He redirected his railway application through a different corridor 6 months later, at greater expense, and the boundary was formally settled in the Ashby favor the following spring. She saw him once, at a county assembly the following year. He was across the room. He caught her eye and held it for a moment, not with hostility, but with the steady regard of a man encountering someone who beat him at his own game and has not yet entirely decided how to file that fact. He inclined his head, very slightly. She returned the courtesy with equal measure and looked away first. The Northfield Trust was the beginning of something she hadn't anticipated. The agricultural school established on the land took its first 12 students the following autumn. Viola sat on its governing board and found, as she had found before with estate accounts and solicitors' files and documents assembled in a single night, that she was very good at building things meant to last. Thomas qualified as a solicitor and took a position in Bristol. Peter's horses turned a profit that suggested he had always been paying closer attention than anyone realized. Her father took on a partner for the estate management, and the account books began to look like the work of people who would still be solvent in 10 years. There was also, in time, a man named Edward Calloway, a land surveyor commissioned to reroute the Cavendrath Railway, who had read the original boundary survey and written to ask a technical question about its methodology. She answered precisely. He wrote again. By April, he was asking questions that had nothing to do with land surveys, and on an evening when the Northfield was visible in the middle distance, he asked, with the slightly awkward precision of a man who has rehearsed the words and lost them, whether she might consider walking out with him formally. "You'll want to know," she said, "that I have opinions about land management, and account books, and the proper construction of legal documents, and a number of other things that men in your position generally find inconvenient." He looked at her with clear, direct eyes. "I know," he said. "I've read your letters, all of them." "And?" "I asked you a question. I was hoping for an answer." She looked at the Northfield, the field that had started everything, that had been the mechanism and the battleground, and was now a school. She thought of her father's letter against her ribs on the morning of the wedding. She thought of the church, the altar, the document in the white roses. She thought, I have always known how to protect what matters. I am only just learning how to choose what I want. Yes, she said, I'll walk out with you. He nodded, with the relief of a man who had been more nervous than he looked. Good. Which direction? She pointed. Toward the field, toward the school, toward the hard-won thing she had built from the materials of a threat, in the only direction she knew how to move. Forward. What do you think Viola does the morning after? Not the grand gesture, the ordinary morning. What does a woman like that do with a Tuesday? There's something in that question worth sitting with, because the church scene is the story we tell. The bouquet, the document, the Duke's face going still. But the Tuesday is where the actual life is. The account books still need doing. The trust still needs governing. And the letters still need answering. The extraordinary thing about women like Viola is not the single moment of nerve. It's that they go home afterward and keep building. We've all had a moment where we found the third option, where we refused the choice we were handed and looked for another way. Most of us don't talk about the Tuesday that followed. Maybe we should. What is the moment in this story you would have found hardest to do yourself? Tell us in the comments. If this story stayed with you, leave one of these words, the bouquet. If you believe the best plans are the ones nobody sees coming, the third option. If you've ever refused the choices you were handed and looked for another way, the north field. If you've ever turned something that was taken from you into something that couldn't be taken again. If you know someone facing an impossible choice right now, someone who needs to hear that the options in front of them might not be all the options there are, send them this story, not as advice, as company. This channel is for the stories where the character doesn't wait to be saved, where the resolution comes from a desk at midnight and a clear head, and the refusal to accept the framing. If that's the kind of story you need more of, subscribe. There are more coming.